Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Dr. Jackie Cawley from the Delean Institute for Growth and Wellness. And today's conversation is going to be on change management and how you can learn to crush change management. It's a very important leadership skill. And when used appropriately, you can help manage and lead people through changes that can be anything from a personal change to a team change to a large organizational change. We'll go through all of those in just a few minutes. But why is it an important leadership skill? Well, if you're fostering a good change management process, you will allow your workforce to be much more adaptable, better at problem solving, more engaged, and they'll be able to adopt it much better. But it really takes a good process to do that. Why? Because change is hard. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get started in the session. So I love this quote. This quote is by Heraclitus, who is a Greek philosopher from 500 BC. So you can see that change has been an issue for hundreds and thousands of years. The only constant is change. So things change all the time. You can see the picture here is of leaves falling. In the Northern Hemisphere, we're moving into fall. It's a beautiful season. It's one of my favorite seasons. And when you think about change, we're changing all the time. For businesses, it could be mergers and acquisitions. It could be an implementation of new technology like a new electronic medical record, which is not uncommon in healthcare. Or it could just be the change of the seasons. I love the fall. My husband thinks of it as the season of death. So people come to change with very different perspectives. But overall, one thing is for sure, change can be hard. And the reason that it's hard is it's because it's very emotionally charged. So this is another quote by Paul Senge that I like. People don't resist change. They resist being changed because it's a very emotional process. And oftentimes when someone is being asked to change their behavior, change their workflow, change the workplace, change where they live, whatever, it tends to bring about a lot of emotion, and sometimes that emotion can be loss, which then has to be grieved and felt and validated. And so the other emotions that you'll oftentimes see will include things like fear, anxiety, and confusion. So you have to make sure that you're taking into consideration people's emotions and how they're feeling when they're faced with a change. Now, when you think about change, there are 5 stages of grief or loss that are very well known through the Kubler-Ross stages. And they include what you see here on the slide: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Now, what's interesting is that when people are moving through these stages, it's not linear. It's not like you move from one stage to the other. Sometimes you can be moving through and then bounce back to a previous one until you get all the way to acceptance. Now, why denial? Well, when something is coming at us as a change, we may face that change and say, this can't be happening. It can't be happening now. It can't be happening to me. For example, a merger and acquisition where your position is eliminated or the organization starts to collapse 2 different buildings into a single one or 2 different regions into a single one. That can be a very stressful thing for people. Another would be like the global pandemic. Oh my gosh, how can this be happening? Now I'm going to be working remotely. I have to be looking for food. I'm going to be isolated, home working with my children. This can't be happening, but it is. So the next stage that you'll often see associated with that change will be anger. So people will get angry about the fact that they have to deal with this change. Whether it is a short change, a big change, that anger tends to come through. And then people want to know what's in it for me. How is this going to impact me personally? And so what you'll start to see is some bargaining. Well, I don't necessarily like that change, but if I go along with you, how can I make it easier for myself? Once they go through that bargaining stage, the next piece is often depression, where people will feel maybe not necessarily fully depressed, but they might be sad. They might really just be grieving that loss, and they're feeling down about having to make this big change. And then finally, they'll get to a point of acceptance where they'll move through the change, adopt the change, and finally accept that change. But it can be a very difficult process for people. And you really have to acknowledge the emotions that people will go through. So that's one of the most critical things that you have to really pay attention to as you're going through a change process. You have to understand the emotions tied to it. A top emotion will be loss, which has to become through almost like a grieving process. And those 5 stages of Kubler-Ross are important to keep in mind. Now, when we think about change management, what's really meant by that? Well, change management is having some type of a structured process that allows you to follow a number of steps to lead and manage people through change. We'll go through individual of those steps, but they really are in 3 phases. The way that I like to think about it is in 3 phases, with the first phase being setting up the climate for change, making sure that you are building a sense of urgency, that you are creating the why and why now so that people can understand that. The next thing that you want to do is really create a vision for what that new place or new state or future looks like, so that you can sell it and get people to hear it and come on board with you in the future. So that's really important, having a guiding coalition to help you build that vision, help you build the plan, walk through those steps with you. The second stage is the engagement and the enablement phase. And what we mean by that is that you need to engage people with really good communication, that strong vision, that why and that why now, and get representation from across your entire organization. So that representation should include all levels of the organization, all units of the organization, so that you have good input and you've got engagement from people across your entire workforce. So, for example, in one healthcare system I worked in, we were implementing a brand new electronic medical record. To do that, we brought people from all different roles from across the organization, placed them into a common space. It was a big space. And then we made decisions as a group about what the workflows would be like, how we would make decisions. And that was used to actually build the technology out for us. And without that level of engagement, we never would have gotten people on board. We also could then use those representatives as champions in their individual departments and subject matter experts to help us get the frontline workforce really engaged as well and trained up to be able to accept that new technology. Then you have to communicate, and communicate often, and communicate not just to someone's logical mind about why, but also to their hearts, because remember, this is emotionally charged. And then finally, you plan for how to implement and then how to sustain that change, because habits are easy to fall back into. Old workflows are easy to flow back into. People will go back if they can because it's easier for them. So you do have to make sure that you have a good sustainability plan. So I'm going to share my screen again, and we'll go through what that looks like along with John Kotter, his model for change, which takes those 3 phases and builds it out into 8 steps. This is a very well-known approach. There's many approaches, but John Kotter's is one of the best, and you'll see it in basically every leadership class. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again and move to the next slide, which is again change management being that structured process to help manage those people through change. And you can see here is Kotter's slides with his 8 steps. So again, you're creating that climate, engaging and enabling the organization, and implementing and sustaining the change. So we talked about that burning platform, why now, developing that vision and getting that guiding team together to help lead this at the most highest level. The next thing is making sure that you've got a strong communication plan that really speaks to the what's in it for me of all the people in your organization. The next piece is also important, the enablement piece, and that's making sure that people have the skills, the knowledge, the tools, and the resources that they need in order to be successful in adopting that new change, that new state, that new future that you want to roll out. And then as you're communicating and starting to make this go forward, you want to celebrate any short-term wins that you have. Finally, implementing and sustaining, make sure you don't let up, adjust where you need to, modify and listen to your front line because they'll tell you a lot of really good information. And then finally, make it stick by having that sustainability plan. One really important thing to note as you're going through organizational change is that people will reach what we call in the technology world as the valley of despair. And you will see this every time you roll out something like a new technology, such as an electronic medical record. And we would usually see the valley of despair on day number 3 of implementation. It never failed. And so I like this quote as well by Rosabeth Moss because everything in the middle can look like failure. You can get people engaged and you can get them enabled by training them up with the skills and the tools and the knowledge and the resources necessary to adopt the change. People get all excited. You got your champions and your subject matter experts and your leaders all doing rah-rah, being on the floors, being out in the working with your workforce, getting things going. And then people adopt the change and things are harder than they maybe expected. And so it's pretty typical that that depression that we talked about with the emotions of the stages of grief and loss and change, it can feel very disheartening and people will be in this little valley of despair for a short period of time. Now, some people will stay in that valley, but what's important as a manager and as a leader is to recognize it and then be able to identify what is it that individuals need to pull them out of that valley and to get them feeling that they can be successful again, because nobody likes to feel like a failure and nobody wants to not be successful. And so if they're feeling inadequate or lack of confidence around being able to adopt that new change, whether it's a workflow, the way that the team dynamics are made up, a new technology, a new way of doing the business, it can all be a little disheartening if you don't think you're going to be successful. So it is really important to make sure that you're listening to individuals, understanding where they are, validating that, celebrating any wins that you do have to help build momentum and get people out of that valley of despair and back up to feeling more positive about their adoption and the ability to take on that change and move into the future with confidence. So really important to remember that. And the other piece that's really key is understanding what's in it for individuals. Again, you got to communicate to the head and the heart, which means that consistent, simple messages that use stories can be really, really effective. And having those simple messages that everyone can use and cascade across and down the organization is vital. But you do have to make it personal. And the place that often in organizations where there's a problem is in middle management. And the reason that we see that in middle management is because you'll have executive teams that are very excited about what's going on. And they'll be able to communicate their messages to the vice presidents, to the directors. Once it gets to the manager and the supervisor level, sometimes those communications can start to break down. And the managers and the supervisors aren't always having the tools and resources they need to be able to communicate and support their frontline workers. So you have to make sure that you pay attention to that middle management, understand that they need to know what's in it for them, and then they need to be able to carry those consistent, simple messages that speak to the head and the heart and address the emotions down to their workforce. And then vice versa, be able to bring what's going on with the workforce at the front line back to senior leaders so that they can make adjustments and modifications where they need to keep people out of that valley of despair as much as possible. Again, you need to think about those 3 phases and make sure that you're engaging and enabling your workforce and thinking it through with a process so that you can really implement that change successfully and then help people not slide backwards. Next, we'll talk about team change. It's similar, but has some differences as well. So I hope you'll join me for the next segment where we'll go over how to work on change with your team and individual employees. See you soon.